My background is that I've been studying specifically really soil and carbon for the last 7 or 8 years, all the way down to the sub-micron level, looking at carbon and soil interactions using some of the best technology in the world, and all the way up to doing global syntheses, looking at how different applications of materials affect soil carbon over time. So I'm going to kind of give a background on the science of carbon and how soil health can kind of interact with that. Very touchy. All right. So first is just setting the stage for net carbon sequestration. There's a really important difference between trying to gain soil carbon in the soils and if we want to achieve climate mitigation, and that's the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in soils. So despite possible increases in soil carbon, that doesn't necessarily mean you're actually mitigating climate change. It just means you're gaining soil carbon. We often use it as a proxy, hopefully, to say that we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but that's not always true. So it's very important that we understand that net carbon sequestration is the net additional storage of carbon in whatever pool that we're looking at. Sometimes it's in the ocean, terrestrial, or biomass, and accounting for any greenhouse gas emission losses. So that's carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. Those are the big three that we'd like to think about, but there are several other greenhouse gas emissions. So soil organic carbon and matter. I kind of like to just give that definition of what even is soil organic matter. So it's that living and dead portions of the soil that is less than, so soil is less than 2 millimeters in size. So soil organic matter is generally anything that's less than 2 millimeters and is of that original biotic, whether it is dead biomass, dead bacteria, dead microorganisms, or living as well. The main portion of soil organic matter is carbon. So that's why we kind of associate soil organic matter and soil carbon together, because soil carbon is somewhere between 50 and 60% of soil organic matter, where the rest of it is made up of hydrogen, oxygen, and then some of our other essential plant nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium. So that's where we like to think that soil organic matter is great for carbon, but also for providing plant essential nutrients. So luckily, most of my things are to the right of the slide, so we don't have to worry too much about what's being cut off. So soil organic matter theory and what we think about it has really changed over the last 15 years. Actually, Dr. Marcus Kleber, or Kleber, I'm not sure the pronunciation of his last name, but at OSU, he's actually one of the top scientists that really helped lead this transition in our thinking. But essentially what the prior theory on soil organic matter is that there was different types of material, and that some of it would be recalcitrant, or it would be protected from microbial decay based on its chemical complexity. But we've kind of learned over the years that that's really just not what's actually happening. A lot of it is whether or not it is the environment at which the carbon is existing in the soil. And we have to think that this is really at the micron level. So using a microscope level, all these small pores, all these aggregates in the soil, it's happening at that small level. And really the advancement in our technologies has really shown to prove this, that some of our longest living carbon can even come from what was previously thought as labile or easily decomposed material for microbes. Whereas some things like lignin, maybe you've heard of, which is kind of components in wood, that was previously thought to be recalcitrant, but it's mainly the environment that we find those things in, but it can actually be easily decomposed. So how does soil organic matter and carbon persist for centuries? So this figure on the right, it was one of the most important papers that came out in the last decade, 2011. So in I think all of my slides, I give the citations at the bottom, so you can go back and find the papers. I'm pretty sure most of them that I give are open access, so you'll be able to read the papers in full. But the left side of the figure kind of gives that historical view where we thought we were looking at different compounds that were more stable in the soil, where we've kind of learned on the right what the emerging science is, that sometimes it's that physical disconnection of the organic matter from the microbes. So the microbes can't access the matter sometimes that's in a small pore because their size is too big. Or there is freezing and thawing. So if we think about up in the permafrost areas up north in the tundra, because it's so cold, microbes really don't really perform much except for during the summers. There's also what's called organomineral associations. So essentially what went from recalcitrance, we're now looking at physiochemical protection, which is these organomineral associations where different metals in the soil is helping preserve that carbon that kind of makes it too difficult for microbes and organisms to kind of pull off the soil. So that's kind of how we're thinking that the persistence is occurring. And then also at the bottom is deep soil carbon that we're still learning a lot more about, but kind of with that same thought is that there's less oxygen in deeper soils, there's less ability for microbes to have activity, colder temperatures, things like that that are kind of helping preserve that carbon. And this is a slide for everyone to go back to. It's some of the best new science on soil carbon. You'll actually even notice that Dr. Kleber's on a few of them. And this top one, it was a paper or a journal article that came out last year. It's a layperson's understanding to what soil carbon and the current science is. I really recommend that reading first for pretty much everyone here, unless you want to really go into the weeds of the science. So some thinking about soil health and the practices that can kind of achieve carbon sequestration. The way that I always like to frame it is that soil carbon sequestration should not be the primary objective with soil health practices. I know that's the hot topic, that's where a lot of the money is, but it shouldn't be that sole driver, and that we should view it as a possible co-benefit. Because one of the things that I said at the very beginning is that soil carbon is a proxy that we sometimes hope is that it's a climate mitigation tool, whereas we really need the measurement of net greenhouse gas emissions to really determine of what these practices are doing for the climate. But some of the things we do know some practices really do reduce greenhouse gas emissions no matter what, whether it's like nitrogen use efficiency. So if we're using our nitrogen fertilizers better through like the 4 R's, so like right time, right rate, right area. So just making sure that we're using our nitrogen fertilizers appropriately can reduce nitrous oxide emissions, which is the most powerful greenhouse gas emission in agriculture. Increasing perennial crop areas, the riparian areas that we were mentioning earlier, reduction of fuel usage. So if we're converting to no-till and we're kind of stopping the use of the tractor and the fuel usage behind that, these are kind of the ways that we can think of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's some environmental constraints that we need to think about. So obviously there's been some lofty goals thrown out there for trying to increase soil carbon across the world, including the 4 parts per million goal that came out of Europe. So what we're kind of seeing is that there's environmental constraints, whether it's stoichiometric, whether there's not enough nitrogen or phosphorus, because soil organic matter is a whole complex of those different minerals and metals and elements. We need all of these different elements to make that soil organic matter. So we're thinking about like microbes. Microbes just aren't carbon, they have nitrogen, they have phosphorus, so they need all of those different nutrients to grow as well. So without nitrogen, without phosphorus, we can't have more carbon. So for one thing, we need more nitrogen, but we also need water. Every living thing requires water to grow. So having more carbon, we need more water. So kind of with knowing that, with the drying that we're seeing, especially across the West, there's been even evidence that we'll just naturally see declining carbon stocks, just because if microbial activity and plant production is declined, usually that's less inputs to the soil. So there's a lot of these restrictions that can prevent us from kind of increasing that soil carbon. And then I just put down here, because all of these topics that I present today, I could talk for hours on each one, but there's different things such as carbon saturation, where there's certain thresholds you can't go past in the soil, and then greenhouse gas pulsing. So with different precipitation intensities, you can have pulsing of your greenhouse gas emissions on your soils. But then, so I'm one soil carbon scientist. I would like to show you what others are thinking as well in this area. So this review article, it's kind of a report, came out this year in the summer, where they interviewed and focused groups with research academia, some governmental employees, and they wanted to know kind of what the views on soil carbon was in croplands. Not with passport. Can you try and unmute it? I think we're good. Cool. That was me. Oh. Okay, we're on track. So one of the main things is that soil sampling is the utmost important thing to kind of determine what's going on in the soil. We can't just rely on remote sensing. There's a lot of private groups out there. There's some scientists as well that are really pushing. Maybe we could just do remote sensing, satellites. We really need to ground truth a lot of that work with in-field sampling. It is expensive, it is laborious, but it is the only way to truly measure carbon changes over time. Soils are just so heterogeneous that without fully measuring, it's going to be difficult to actually get to small scale levels. So this is kind of the point that I said at the beginning about soil health, is that the scientists believe that soil health the main role of it, or the main role of these different practices should be for soil health, not for soil carbon gains. Because once again, there's too much uncertainty that, maybe cover crops increases soil carbon on the west side of Oregon, but maybe not in the northeast portion of Oregon. The climates, all of these things, it's hard to make blanket statements about how one practice will affect soil carbon or greenhouse gas emissions in these different regions. So participants in this focus groups they emphasized that they need to track all greenhouse gas emissions, as I mentioned, and that soil carbon, if you're focused on soil carbon alone, that it could fail to accurately quantify the climate effects from these different management practices. And once I'm going to leave these to go over if you want to back and reviewing this PowerPoint, but you can see these different breakdowns and also the citation for the report at the bottom, which is open access. Trade-offs. So one of the things I like to think about with soil health practices are there's always trade-offs, especially if we're trying to focus on soil carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. So this meta-analysis done by Jean et al., they looked at how cover crops, so it's comparing a cover crop versus a no cover crop control, and it's a global synthesis, and looked at how there's multiple charts here that I'm not showing, but they looked at different parameters and how cover crop usage affects different parameters. So these top three, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, cover cropping actually increased greenhouse gas emissions. Whereas for the most important part, cover crops should be thought of as reducing erosion, reducing runoff, and reducing leaching. So the bottom axis is percent change. Cover cropping reduced erosion by almost 80%, runoff by about 70%, and leaching, so loss of like nitrogen through the soil profile by 50%. Now, that's really what the amazing things that are happening with cover crops is that we're preserving our soil and we're reducing nitrogen loss, so improving water quality. Whereas it's not shown on this chart, it does increase soil organic carbon, but this review didn't quantify it because it wasn't their goal. With limited, so just going to walk over. There is limited data sets, so there's about 43 data sets that reported carbon dioxide, whereas there was 267 studies that looked at loss of nitrogen in the soil profile. So we do have limited data sets. That is important for context, but with the data that's currently out there, we're increasing emissions, but we're doing a great job at preserving our soil and reducing loss of like nitrogen, and also increasing biomass and yield. So there's pros and cons. No-till, so and to an extent reduced tillage is thought in the same way. We want to kind of preserve our soil and reduce the losses of nitrogen in the soil. This review looked at, it was a paired analysis from around the world looking at tillage versus reduced tillage. And in the surface, if we look on the chart at the right, we have 500 studies almost that looked at 0 to 10 centimeters. Whereas at the bottom profile, we have 57 studies that did greater than 60 centimeters. This is important for context because most of our data is just looking at that very surface, because most studies prior to, I don't know, around 2010, really the point was soil fertility. We cared about how does it affect our crop yields. Whereas now we're starting to think about carbon. That's where we're starting to get more studies with deeper soil data points. But the point of this story is that right now the data suggests that we're losing so much carbon from 10 to say 60 centimeters that it is actually outweighing the gains in soil carbon at that surface soil. So this study did find that after about 14 years that they were able to recoup the losses of soil carbon. So it's not just one story, it is a continuous story that we're looking at. And it's just, we would have essentially, according to this analysis, a 14-year gap that we actually lost a lot of carbon. There is also this other analysis that looked at greenhouse gas emissions. Once again, it didn't really compare with soil carbon, but right now it showed that it's comparing a no-till versus conventional till, that we had a reduction in CO2. So left side is a reduction, right side of the line is an increase in emissions. We had a decrease in CO2 and methane when we had no-till, but we increased significantly our nitrous oxide emissions. And this is important also in context that nitrous oxide is 300 times the warming potential of CO2. So once again, it didn't really calculate the total differences, so like adding in all those 3 greenhouse gases, but once again, it's just thinking about the data collectively.
We're going to hold the questions till the end.
Okay. I'll wrap up. I don't know what I'm at for time.
Yeah, you're
okay. Okay. Well, future pathways, enhanced weathering. If you haven't heard of it, it's kind of crushed rock. It's a potential pathway for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. One of the things I always like to talk about is the quality of evidence reviews. And there's unfortunately in environmental science, low quality reviews and providing of transparency of the data sets behind them. it has been found even in a lot of these soil carbon analyses or meta-analyses and reviews that there needs to be improved quality. I've been working on one the last couple of years for my postdoc. I'm trying to finishing up, but it's really trying to improve data quality, data transparency, looking at the data and making sure that we're accounting for all the biases of these individual primary research articles. And the last thing I'll say is that looking through this presentation, there is this database that kind of looks at environmental reviews and shows the biases that may be occurring in these different types of reviews. It's only been doing it the last few years, so it's kind of still new. And yeah, with that, I'll just wait for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Mike.